This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Saturday Social with me, Will Mercer. Today, we are going to be talking about thinking in the classroom, discussion, debate, reasoning, how to teach those things for children, and how to overcome any problems that may arise when you are teaching them.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Okay, and welcome to the show, and thank you very much for listening. So, Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And that's a bold statement, but it speaks to a certain perspective about what education should be. A perspective that says that education isn't just about absorbing facts, but it's about questioning, reflecting, and making sense of the world around us. Essentially, it is saying, if we want to prepare our students for life, we must teach them not just what to think, but how to think. And more recently, John Dewey has echoed this idea, and he said, quote, "The aim of education is not the acquisition of facts, but the cultivation of a mind that can think," end quote. Again, this perspective that our classroom should be places where curiosity thrives, where students learn to ask great questions, challenge assumptions, and engage in meaningful discussions. Debate, reasoning, critical thinking, they're not just academic skills, but they're life skills. So we're going to be talking about some of these. We're going to interrogate this perspective and talk about how to promote it in the classroom. And I say we because it's not just me today, but I'm also joined by the brilliant Will Ord. Now, Will's with me, and he was a teacher, he's worked with, been an RE teacher, was chair of Sapere, the Philosophy for Children charity. But for most of his career, he's been involved with teacher training, which he currently does through the Thinking Education website. So, Will, hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning, Will.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm just off the back of half term, so feeling nourished and ready to go again.
Fantastic. It's about as good as it gets, isn't it, really? Or maybe that's the first day of half term, actually, is about as good as it gets.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm also desperately looking for signs of spring. I think enough winter weather.
I can guess. So, I mean, paint me a picture, but I'm going to assume in the UK it's grey. You haven't seen the sun for weeks, and it's just not very pleasant. Is that about right?
Yes, I think you're 90% there. That said, I have to confess, I've had a 3-week retreat in India, so I'm not.
Oh, okay. So it's not all. So it's not all doom and gloom then.
Absolutely not. No, no. I'm just greedy. I just want spring to start. And yeah, no, it's looking good though.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's get into it then. So I was starting with that Socrates quote: "The unexamined life is not worth living." Now, that's often thrown out there. I'm sure many people listening will have heard that before, but I think it really does capture the essence of what I think we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about thinking, reasoning in the classroom. I mean, shall we start with the why of it? I mean, why, if someone's advancing this perspective and they're, let's say, arguing for it, what is the reason why is it so important to teach thinking in the classroom, do you think?
Yes. Well, I might start with Socrates, actually. One of his reasons was if you had an unthinking population, they were always open to exploitation and tyranny. So I suppose my first reason, and certainly looking around the world and modern politics and recent elections, I think there's a huge reason for people to think clearly, to communicate well, particularly to argue, know how to argue well together. So I suppose that's the first practical reason, is maybe to be a good, active citizen, you've got to be a thinking citizen. And goodness knows, given the challenges of the 21st century, we need to be able to think together to resolve problems and work out ways forward. So that's maybe the first reason, but maybe more centered on the classroom. There's the whole idea of learning, what that word means. And as you were saying, it's not the grad grind, facts, facts, facts. They've got to be able to think coherently about the subjects and the ideas and the concepts that they're studying. Another couple of reasons, though, just life in general, I think is far richer, far deeper than a life that's unexamined. If you can think well, you can ask your questions, you can investigate things, you can share ideas, you can think what we might say critically, collaboratively, creatively, and caringly, the 4 C's of thinking, as it's called, then that's all to the good. And finally, I would say the fourth reason, apart from the citizenship, the learning, and the life, is, I suppose, a subset of the life section is to form good relationships. In order to, and I would say that's probably the greatest predictor of a happy or a contented or a successful life. We might use the word well-being in there as well. But to form the quality of relationships is probably the greatest predictor of a happy life. And in order to form relationships, of course, we've got to be able to understand each other, to reason through disagreements, to collaborate on how we might make decisions, particularly when we disagree or have different perspectives. So I'd say, thinking is absolutely fundamental. And for me, it's fundamentally important, but it's also very interesting, very motivating to explore this world of thinking, look at the concepts, and we are surrounded. Every subject, every part of life is surrounded by concepts and ideas that are open to investigation. And so, when we look at our identity, for example, our values, what do we find important? Can we think those through? Can we find evidence and reasons and ideas that support them? Are we open to reorientating our thinking, to yielding to other perspectives? And can we hold a space where we can get represented? Just recently, I've been working with a group of girls' schools, and they've been looking at, in a world that has yet to be cured of sexism, if I can put it like that. How do you encourage girls to build confidence and courage in a world where there is prejudice? And if we say, if racism or sexism or homophobia or any of these things, they're all about power and prejudice. And it's how can you represent yourself and defend yourself in a world like that? And for that, you need thinking. So I would argue that it's the ability to think and communicate is fundamental, emphasizing perhaps the art of argument. But
it's such a fantastic. Sorry, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, because that was such a fantastic answer. I think that's put it so well. But I want to push you on it a little bit, because I'm gonna give you what I imagine is a very, very common objection people make. Kind of any time. And it's a very understandable thing. I don't think it's sort of, I'm playing devil's advocate as such. But if someone's in a very busy school, the timetable is crowded, and they say, okay, that's all well and good. I absolutely accept that critical thinking, building relationships, being able to articulate my point of view, these are absolutely fundamental life skills. Great. But I've got a curriculum to teach, and I've got a test to get my children ready for. Right. So how do you sort of counter that sort of, or what would you say to someone who says that?
Well, I on the one hand, I completely accept, we've got a quart and pint pot situation with the curriculum. I think it's terribly bloated. I would preference going for depth, and less breadth. I think we've got a kind of a curriculum that's a mile wide but an inch deep, because teachers are just forced to teach so much content. I would say, particularly if they're looking for good grades and that sort of stuff, where they've got to keep parents and Ofsted or school inspections happy, all of that sort of stuff. I'd say it's a false economy to think that critical thinking is some kind of side issue luxury. I think you're going to get far better grades, and the absolute test of this, Will, is when, at least in the English context, students move from GCSEs to A level. If they've been taught to the test, as it were, for GCSEs, and this might be controversial, but I would argue that frankly you can get quite reasonable grades by being taught to the test up to GCSE. If, however, you want them to go on to A level, they've got to have critical thinking, caring, collaborative thinking, all of those. They've got to be well practiced in those to do well at A level. So it really is a false economy to think, well, we'll just leave it to A level and shove it in there. This has got to start at primary school. This has got to start really, really early. And so for someone who's saying, that's lovely, but we don't have time, I would say, actually, all we have is time. We can't do anything about time. What we can do something about is about making it a priority. Why are we prioritizing buckets and buckets of knowledge that frankly can be looked up very often on a web, and not giving the sort of how do we deal with the information? How do we think through it? So we're talking about the difference really between knowledge and understanding. If the national curriculum here demands that we have knowledge, skills, and understanding. So in order to understand something, you've got to have a whole other set of skills rather than just regurgitating information to order. So I do take the point, though. I've worked in thousands of schools over 20 years in 20 different countries, and it's a common refrain. That's lovely. We agree with this, but we don't have the time. I would argue you do have the time. What you don't have is the priority, and the priority of making thinking skills a core thing. That's important. There is one other side issue to this, which I think is important to mention. It's often argued, and I think well and perfectly justifiable, that critical thinking and skills like that are subject specific, that you can't be generic about it. So you can't have an inset day or some training time where it's on critical thinking and you've got different subjects in front of you. So on the one hand, I completely accept that what critical thinking might mean in history would be different to and have different language and that sort of stuff to critical thinking in science, to critical thinking in music, to critical thinking in art. So on the one hand, there is subject specificity, but on the other, I think there are absolutely some core generic skills that go across the board. For example, logic and reasoning. The vocabulary of just having words like proposition, to agreeing with, agreeing against, or reasoning against, conclusion, having cogent, valid and sound arguments. There's a vocabulary that goes across the board. And if you think of, let's say a scientist says, well, look, critical thinking is in my domain. You can't, there's not a generic argument for it. I'd say, well, just think of a modern scientist. Let's say that they're working in a genetic lab. Now, okay, they've got to use critical thinking in the scientific way when they're looking at data and creating experiments. But they're also human beings who are working with budgets. So they've got to do critical thinking about how do we spend the budget? What do we prioritize? What are our values here? They've got to work with colleagues. So they've got to argue and decide things, human to human. And that's not necessarily all about scientific critical thinking. That's critical thinking in general. But more broadly, kids need to learn it for life. It's just a broad life skill, and that is absolutely part and parcel of education. But we can't look through the schooling lens.
It's got. I see. Well, I'm going to interrupt you because there's something that I really want to I don't know if this is a bit of a tangent or not, but it's something that you've mentioned a few times, and I want to explore it before it goes, which is this link between thinking and speaking. Because I mean, in my experience, schools I've worked at in the past, one way some teachers have really, let's say, been converted to, or when they've really seen the benefit, let's say, of approaches like philosophy for children or talking about critical thinking with your children or whatever it might be. One of the ways they've seen those benefits is when they see the children become much more articulate in kind of any walk of life, really, not just within the classroom, but when you mentioned Ofsted before, if Ofsted visit, and you need children to do an interview, I found that the children who are practicing speaking, debating, discussing, and listening as well, the other side of that, just as important, the children who are well versed in that have they are simply able to articulate themselves with a confidence and with a clarity that they may not have otherwise had. And, before I ever became a teacher and ever tried to do this stuff, I always kind of thought of thinking as something that goes on inside your head that's not necessarily spoken, right? You think what you're going to say and then you say it. But as maybe it sounds like I'm doing right now, I actually think that's just not the way human beings work. And I certainly don't think that's the way it works in the classroom with children, when there's this great relation between speaking and thought. And I mean, could you tell me a bit more about that? What are your views on that?
It's a wonderfully interesting and powerful area, Will. That's a great question. I mean, my first question with it really is, can you have a thought without words? So that the idea that they're separate in the first place is open to question. And of course, we might get into, hold on, what do we mean by thinking? Can you think in images, for example? But generally speaking, people think with what's sometimes called a subvocal locutor, a voice in their head that is reasoning. So when
sorry, I've never heard that phrase before. I love that, subvocal locutor. That's brilliant. Okay, I'm gonna. I'm now looking for a chance to use that.
Just casually pop it into a conversation.
I will. In the staff room next week, I'm definitely dropping that into conversation, like I've known it for years and years. Absolutely.
you might get some strange looks. So yes, it's the relationship between speaking and thinking is a really fascinating one. And I think it's as you say, it's when you practice this stuff out loud and with others. There's a process, and I think Lev Vygotsky, was he a Russian psychologist? He talked of the internalization of external dialogue. So you have a chat with other people, and that discussion goes inside your head, and the discussion indeed might carry on as you have some thoughts after a good discussion with colleagues or friends or pupils, and that enriches your internal thinking and verbalization with the internal voice. And then, of course, you go back to the group and you've got an enriched vocabulary and enriched sort of group of ideas and concepts to exchange with. So there's this interaction between the external dialogue and the internal dialogue, and one is feeding the other. So it's a very sort of benign dynamic. And
I guess it feeds into. Sorry, I guess it feeds into the classroom, doesn't it? Because of course, most of us, most of us teachers, we're going to be teaching groups of children. So you can absolutely take advantage of that social aspect of it to get them thinking collaboratively, like you've mentioned before. Get them thinking collaboratively, and producing something where the sum is more than its parts. The sum of the whole being more than its parts.
Yeah, as the phrase goes, none of us is as smart as all of us. And when you get collaborative thinking going, then you get a real acceleration. But it's not only that the thinking, you've got all of the social and emotional aspects of that. And indeed, if you look at the, I think Voice 21, which is this organization that sets up kind of a focus on oracy in a good number of schools in England, they worked with Cambridge University on how do we define oracy. And it wasn't simply the speaking and listening. They included the social and emotional aspects of all of this communication. The physical. So, what's my body expressing in terms of its gestures? but also things like critical thinking and, of course, things like vocabulary, language, use of rhetoric, and the like. So the idea of oracy, of speaking and listening more broadly, is incredibly rich, and
Mm,
it's a social endeavor. It's how we work out how to do things together in the world, but also how I work out to do things in my own mind. I mean, I'm constantly we often think of arguments, for example, as arguments with other people, but of
mm,
course, all of our decision making, you could say that is a form of argument. If I open the fridge and there's two pieces of cake on the plate in the fridge, there's going to be a little bit of a dialogue in my own head about how many pieces of cake am I going to eat, and
right.
I know which usually wins. But it's
Mm.
kind of it's we think of sort of speaking and listening as something that's done with other people out there, and of course it is. But I think it's well worth looking at the internal dialogues that we have, and that might
Mhm.
include, how much of what's our critical friend like as an internal voice?
Mm.
Are they actually helping us? Do we have quite a brutal critic that will condemn me, will shut my potential down by criticizing
Mm.
things? It's to look at all of this communication, internal and external.
Mm. So if I understand you right, I feel we're saying that it is perhaps maybe not impossible, but certainly very difficult to teach thinking without also or teaching oracy at the same time. That the two sort of do go hand in hand.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm. Okay.
Yes,
Sorry.
yeah. Well, I was just going to add. I mean, for 30 odd years, I've been practicing philosophy for children, and
Hmm.
there's absolutely no doubt in my mind having children think skillfully and well together
Mm.
upgrades what they write, upgrades their thinking, upgrades their relationships. And
Mm.
I've just seen that over and over and over again. And indeed, that can happen with adults. I've used philosophy or P for C, where the C stands for communities. Philosophy for communities. I ran a group for 5 years in Cumbria. We just met once a month in a hotel in Cumbria. Any adults could turn up. We generate questions we wanted to discuss, and we built some very, very strong, healthy, thoughtful relationships in that
Mm.
group. And a lot of the group said, I've got to know other people in this group more than friends I've known for 30 years
Oh
because it's I think it's to do with
wow.
we're discussing serious questions. It's back to that Socrates quote, Will, that you started
Mm.
with. It's we're examining life together, sharing experiences, sharing thoughts and reasons and ideas.
Mm, mm. This now, I hope this doesn't sound like nitpicking, but it's something that sort of jumped out at me, and maybe this is the primary school teacher, the kind of let's all be kind and caring all the time, boys and girls kind of side of me talking, but the use of the word argument is very interesting because I would say, obviously, I think you've presented it very clearly, and I understand what you mean by it. But I think there's lots of maybe classrooms and young people who the argument is almost it is seen as a negative thing. We don't argue in this
Absolutely.
classroom, that sort of thing. Please, stop arguing, that kind of thing. So how would you sort of sell that to people, as it were, or rather, let me put that in a better way. Why do you choose that as your preferred term?
Because yes, great question, and you're absolutely right. One of the sort of common ways that we use the word argument is in that sort of negative connotation. So if I say I had an argument with a friend last week, I think
Mm,
most people are saying, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." That it must
yeah.
have been emotionally disturbing, and that. So it's on the one hand we could completely accept. Okay, that's one way the word is used, but I think we sort of point that out and then put that definition to one side and reclaim the original meaning of the word argument, which is, it's just to go into some of it, but the definition of an argument comes from the Latin arguere,
Mm, mhm,
and that means to make clear, to prove, or to assert something. And
mm,
then we can kind of say, okay, there's the negative or bad arguments, and we can kind of list what makes them bad, and that's a great classroom activity to do. What are the signs or causes of a bad argument? And then you go, well, what's a good argument? And that is to really portray an argument as a reasoned exchange of different viewpoints about something. And it has a purpose, that it helps us to work out what to think and do in life, especially with others. But also remembering arguing happens in our own head. You know, we have lots of big decisions to make in life. I think the other thing is certainly in primary schools. I mean, my feeling is we've got to make the art of argument absolutely core to education, because it goes right across all learning. But I fear that it's, you know, at the moment it kind of happens as something you've got to do for certain essays and exam questions at GCSE and A level. We've got to start the art of argument in primary schools. It's not done nearly enough, early enough, or orally enough. How to practice good oracy and argument with others. And in the primary school, every teacher and parent in the world knows that 3 and 4 year olds argue. So it's not like it's not going on. The real challenge is what's the quality of it? What's it like? Do they understand that there are some good arguments, that it can be a really useful and interesting and inspiring way to communicate? It's not this negative emotional shouting match. So you're quite right. I would totally agree. I think we've got to reclaim the true meaning of the word argument and acknowledge, on the one hand, it's got its negative uses, but push that aside swiftly and then get into what are they and how do they work.
Okay, and there's one thing I think we're putting together, or rather I say you are putting together a really lovely, very coherent, very convincing case for teaching thinking in the classroom. But there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, perhaps before we move on. You've mentioned reason and reasoning a few times, and I want to get at the heart of this idea of a rational person or a rational being. And I feel that I'm not going to express this very well, but I want to get at this because I think that's sort of at the heart of what is going on here. And I don't, someone might be listening to this and thinking, oh God, how has he ended up here? How has he got this abstract or this far away from what actually happens in the classroom? But I would disagree. I think when you have a proper exchange of ideas with someone else, that can only happen if you accept that they are rational like you are. That only can happen if you see them as a human being and you approach them with respect that you would want other people to have for you. And I think that's quite a powerful thing, because I guess, I mean, it's pretty sad to say, but a lot of children may not have been given that respect. They may not get it at home, or they may not often experience it in their lives. But when you say to a child, what do you think? And you really care what they have to say, no matter what it is they're going to say, as long as they're thinking about it. I've seen that for myself. It's an incredibly powerful thing you can do for someone. And I think it comes back to this idea of reason and rationality. So, I mean, what are your views on this?
You're absolutely right. It's one of these things with when you're looking at the development of argument, you're kind of assuming that other people are open to being, good with their heart and good with their thinking. When you enter into an argument, it's kind of assuming we understand that reasoning and rationality is a good way to work things out. But of course, not everybody is convinced of that, or indeed had the if you like, the privilege of being introduced to that. There's a lovely quote from Thomas Paine that you remind me of, who's an English political philosopher and author of The Rights of Man. And he said, attempting to debate with a person who's abandoned reason is like giving medicine to the dead. So it's kind of it's a bit bleak, but you do. I mean,
it's vivid. That sticks in the mind.
Yes, absolutely. It's and you see an awful lot of this. If I still engage with it, I don't anymore. But you see an awful lot of this online and in political debates, where people just don't recognize or respect the idea that reason and evidence and examples and defining your terms and all of these great habits of good arguments, they just don't, those aren't respected or used or applied. And that gives you a rotten choice, because you think, well, what do I do? I've come here. I think that our good argument is a way of working things out. But the person I'm having a discussion with doesn't recognize that as a way forward. So it's kind of, and that's where I get down to the 3 P's, as I call them, which is pivot, pause, or persist. You've got to make a very practical decision. Do I pivot out of this situation, just think, okay, I'm trying to give medicine to the dead here. This isn't going to work. So I'm just going to extract myself. Life is short, and this is going to end up in a brutal and pointless argument. So I'm going to pivot out. Or you think, well, I'm going to pause. I'm going to say, okay, but now's not the time to discuss this. I'm going to sort of give it some space and time. I mean, maybe the setting's not right. You're maybe people are in the wrong state of mind, or they're frustrated, or it's just the wrong time. So you're going to pause and return to the argument maybe at a better time. Or indeed, you can persist. You can say, no, I'm going to work this through, and I'm going to see if we can establish just some really important ground rules about how we're going to exchange ideas and different perspectives there.
Okay.
So it's accepting that, rationality and reason isn't a universally respected thing, but then that is all the more argument for making it a fundamental part in primary and secondary education, that everyone should have an introduction to this as a reasonable way forward. If you like, it's wrapped up in the word reasonableness. It's not only reasoning, but it's able to be reasoned with. I'm open to this way of exchange to work things out. And if children aren't getting that at home, or from their peer group, or from their society or community, it's got to happen in school. Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question now, Will, and I'm going to give you a few seconds just to think about it. And the question is this. So you've mentioned reasonableness. How do we do it? Especially you mentioned, primary age children. How are teachers to set that up successfully in their classroom?
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Okay, we're back. This is the Saturday Social with me, Will Mercer. I'm joined by Will Ord. We are talking about teaching thinking in education. Don't forget to join us on the Podbean app, where you can send in your messages and join the conversation. So, Will, a second ago, I said to you, reasonableness, getting children thinking, listening to each other in this kind of atmosphere of respect. How would you go about implementing it for the first time?
That is an absolutely central question. I think the first thing is to relax teachers about it, in the sense that by increments conquer. It's a skill that is learned over time, and it's not to feel like it's kind of got to be done in a week or a half a term or something. So it's something that is built up over time, and it's done in increments, small little games and exercises, where you are building up their ability to learn the vocabulary, but also the kind of the manners, the courtesy of how to communicate well with each other. It's what we might call caring thinking. Let me give you an example. It's a classic in classrooms, the would you rather activity.
Right.
So you might say to your children, would you rather have a magic carpet that takes you anywhere, or a magic wand that makes people laugh, or a magic cloak that makes you invisible? So it's very light, it's open, it's very imaginative and creative, and you get them to think about which one of those three options they prefer. And in the classroom, indeed, you might get them to sort of go and stand in the three different groups. So some have chosen the magic wand that makes people laugh, and some have chosen the magic cloak that makes invisible, some the magic carpet takes anyway. And then you get those groups just to come up with reasons why they've chosen that one. Now, in the classroom, would you rathers are often used, but here's the thing that I would really emphasize in doing it. When you're getting them to express why they've chosen it, they've got to use the vocabulary of thinking. So what do I mean by that? It's if I say, well, why did you choose the magic carpet that takes you anywhere? They can't say, because it would be fun. They've got to reply using the phrasing, I agree with the carpet because, or they could use the phrasing, my reasons for the carpet are. Otherwise, I don't accept their answer. So a rule of the game is to get them to practice this particular phrasing so it becomes absolutely part of the way they express themselves. And then you can do a second round with the three groups. You say, well, why not the other two options? And when they're responding, well, I don't, my reasons against the wand are, or I disagree with the cloak because. So again, they've got to use reasoning for or agreeing with, disagreeing or reasoning against. You could push it further. You could get them to spot assumptions in their choice. You said, have you taken anything for granted in your choice? For example, if someone's chosen the magic carpet that takes them anywhere, they might have assumed that they could choose where the carpet took them, but it doesn't actually say that. It just takes you anywhere. Had you assumed you had the choice to go where it wants? Or had you assumed that the carpet flew? Maybe it just kind of drags you along the floor, or maybe it's a one-way journey. Maybe you had assumed it was a return journey. So through these sort of games and activities, we're getting them to practice the language of assumption, taking things for granted, reasoning for, reasoning against, agreeing with, agreeing again, or not disagreeing with. And it's that vocabulary that's so key. That is the vehicle that allows the skills to transfer across the curriculum and transfer into life. If they haven't got that kind of language, then the skill can't live. And again, it's really coming back to your great question earlier about the link between speaking and thinking. If I haven't got the vocabulary for this, how can I think it in the first place? So I think my first step would be playing games where you practice the vocabulary and you just pick little phrases like agreeing with and disagreeing with. And you just do it like that, a small increment, and just practice that. And just start to see if it starts to bubble up spontaneously in the following weeks. So that's one thing. I think another key thing is to agree and discuss ground rules. So, I mean, every teacher in the world has, sort of classroom rules, or their school rules, and they're sort of laminated on the wall or whatever. I would get them to sort of actually create their own rules for how they want to discuss things and how to argue. So, do we want the rule one person speaks at a time? Or what's called the wait rule? Why am I talking? We want a rule where you've got to know why you're talking. It can't be just, oh, here's something that's popped into my head. You've got to give a reason or explain what you're about to say before you say it.
Right. So now, I'm sure if anyone listening, I hope you're like me, any teacher listening to this, a child, probably one specific child that you've known in your past has just popped into your head at this point, because I can think of one particular boy I taught where I think it would have, let me put it this way, it would have really helped him if I could have said that to him at some point.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted, but I like this. I'm interested by what you said about not accepting an answer. Now, you said before you wouldn't accept an answer if the child said, oh, I want to be on a magic carpet because it's fun. You wanted to use that vocabulary of thinking. And I see there's the vocabulary angle. So straight away, there's a standard there. There's a sort of, because I think people might have a misconception that it's a bit of a free for all, that, it always, I always have to grit my teeth when someone says, "Oh, in philosophy, all answers are equally valid." Well, of course they're not.
Like, oh no,
Right. and it
Yeah.
comes to that sometimes. And I think people might, I can see why it happens, but they might come to that conclusion about, discussions with children, especially very young children doing it for the first time. You might see your role as the teacher is simply to listen, no matter what is being said, and to give it some kind of validation, no matter what is being said. But I like what you say about introducing some standards to it. It's not about having the right or wrong answer, but it is about using that thinking vocabulary. So let me ask you, apart from the vocabulary, what other standards would you expect of children's contributions right from the get-go?
Well, yeah, I think negotiated ground rules where they can see the purpose, and all the better if they can come up with them, because then it's about them obeying their own rules rather than the teacher imposing rules. I think another key thing is to facilitate rather than teach. So that, just as you were saying, I'm not there to make a comment about what they've said in terms of the content, but I am there to skill them up in how they say it and how they respond to each other. So it's about getting them to be measured and thoughtful in how they say things. So one tool I use is Lego blocks or Duplo blocks. I might give 3 of those to each child, and that's how many times they can contribute. So they've got they're holding in their hands the equal right to be included. And it puts a nice kind of limit on the more vocal characters, shall we say, who are often looking for the limelight and the attention rather than thinking about the quality of what they're saying. So when they have an opinion about something, they contribute that one of their Lego blocks. It goes into perhaps the center of the room. And you, again, one of these rules that you might have is you say, okay, the next person to speak must show that their Lego block will connect with the first Lego block. That is, you can't just sort of say something that you've stacked in your head. You've got to have listened to what the last contributor said and show that your contribution is going to connect with that first contribution in some way. Let me give you an example just to put flesh on the bones. Let's say you're talking about bullies. Keep it quite broad. So what do you think about bullies? And someone says, oh, I think bullies are bad people. Okay, there's the first contribution. Now, the second contribution needs to be something like, well, I agree with you because, or I disagree with you because, or I've got an example of that, or I've got an exception to that, or I've got a question about that. Do you mean all bullies or just some bullies are bad people? But they must show that their contribution is connecting. And that's where you get the collaborative thinking and the real quality listening, where they are building ideas together. And this, for me, Will, is the difference between mere Q&A in the classroom and quality learning dialogue. It's where we're really getting them to respect and listen to, engage with what each other are saying. So often I think children aren't listening to the other children because they take the only voice worth listening to is the teacher's. That's the kind of habit or atmosphere they've been introduced to. And I think that needs to change so that they get to respect and see each other as a potential source of wisdom.
I found myself sometimes with my children doing something like this, and I do, what I'm sure many people do, get them sat in a circle so they're all looking at each other. Okay, but then I found there were certain children who would still, even in a circle, just talk to me. And even when I got up and left the circle, they would sort of turn their head around and track me walking around the room. And what I ended up doing with some children was actually, I would always say, everyone, I am always listening to what you're saying, but I would sort of find a quote unquote task to do at my desk. So I was sort of, not making eye contact or anything. I'm not sure that was the best practice really, but that's what I had to do with at least some children to get them to break that habit. And you're right, I think it is a habit lots and lots of children will have of directing, speaking at you. And I think at the same time, there's another habit a lot of children pick up, which is hopefully they will listen to the adults speaking to them, and they will listen to their own voice in their head and when they are speaking. But then when another child is giving an answer, they completely switch off. And I think what really is good about having a structured discussion where you really, like you say, you have the ground rules and you really make it clear to children what you're doing and why you're doing it. One of the benefits of that is that in other lessons, in other parts of school life, I think you do see children actually listening to each other better. It's, again, like so many things in life, it's about instilling a habit. And I think once you instill a habit in the discussion, it often is present throughout the school.
Absolutely will. And I think this is where, if we develop these kinds of schools, every other lesson is going to benefit. Every other teacher is going to benefit. So just as you're saying, if you've got some of these habits, like, for example, you could be quite open about it. Say, look, I'm really listening to what you're saying, but I'm not going to look at you. I want you to look at each other or someone you're agreeing with or disagreeing with. So, and it's you've got to break a habit. You've got to sort of remind them and just encourage that for a while. But pretty soon they get the idea that, oh, we can actually talk directly to each other. Another thing might be just get the last contributor to pick the next person to speak. And
right.
That's just, again, just pulling your influence as the teacher back, becoming more of a facilitator. Just say, and rather than hands up and all sorts of extraordinary yoga positions, that kids adopt, and bouncing up and down the seat and hyperventilating if they're bursting to say something, just keep it calm. Just open a hand, an open hand on the knee. So it's not the sort of forest of hands going up, because that's a real disturbance to the person who's still talking. So just a calm hand open on the knee. I'd like to contribute when this person's finished, or even they've got to finish and then hands open. So these little tweaks, just as you're saying, these little tweaks can make an enormous difference, and the benefit stretches across all the other lessons. It's not confined to, we're doing a thinking lesson today.
Now, you were talking about content before, and in sense of critical thinking can often be best when it's informed by something, it's informed by content knowledge, though of course it can be applied, it's not specific to any one domain. So I want to get your opinion on this, because this is something that I honestly myself, I don't know what the answer is. I tried lots of different ways to get my children talking and thinking with each other. Sometimes that would be an explicit P4C discussion, but often it's not. And when I look back on the really successful ones, there's a few which stand out in my mind, and they were on ones which, so if it's not already obvious, I'm a primary school teacher. There were ones that children knew what they were talking about to some extent. So there was one that really stood out where we had just finished a class novel, and it was a novel that the children were incredibly engaged with. And it started with the simplest question: what was this book about? And of course, straight away, they start telling me about the plot. And I say, no, what were the big ideas? What were the concepts behind this book? And I give an example. I say, I think it was about friendship because blah, blah, blah. They got the idea straight away. And I think this was a year 4 group. And straight away, they were coming up with the big ideas. Oh, it's about your family. It's about history. It's about your experiences shaping your present, whatever. And we ended up with just the most fantastic discussion I think I've ever really had with a group of children. And sometimes I've tried discussions which were more standalone, which more, there was something in the news that was, I thought at least, was thought-provoking, or there was some resource, some YouTube video or something. I thought, they'll really be interested in this. And I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes that works and it's great, but sometimes it doesn't. So I guess my question to you is, given that most discussions spring from a sort of provocation or from a stimulus or from some subject matter, what type of things in your experience tend to make for the best discussions?
That's a fantastic question, Will. And I suppose the first question that comes to mind is what's your objective as a teacher or a facilitator? For example, if I'm starting a new topic on something, let's say we're going to study a war in history. I might have a discussion, and I might give them a visual stimulus of a war, and it might be one stimulus might be a picture of a nuclear bomb going off. And another might be a picture of a medieval war with people in armor and lances and all the rest of it. And just get them to come up with any questions that they're thinking about when they see these two images. And you're bound to get questions about war. And if you contrast the two pictures, there's a sort of sense of time, how war has changed over time. So you might get some other thoughts about war and over time something. So if my objective is to explore their initial ideas of what a war is, then it'd be legitimate to start a topic with that. But the point I think you're making in your question is, are there is it better if they've got a lot more prior knowledge about something and then have the discussion?
Right.
So I would say sometimes it's fine if it's just they know a little bit and you can just start and play with the idea and the concept of war and what they think it is. And that's very informative for the teacher. You get to find out misconceptions, what they already know, gaps in their knowledge. It allows you to teach much more efficiently. However, it might be that you're going to do war. You go through a kind of a normal lesson where we're exploring war and this war and blah, blah, and giving them facts and information, blah, blah, blah. And then halfway through that series of lessons, so you've got a little sort of program of lessons you're doing, maybe halfway through, then you have an open, thoughtful discussion about it, just to check, are they understanding things so far? What are their beliefs and thoughts and opinions and feelings about what we've been studying? Are their concepts getting richer? So it could be a halfway through a series of lessons as a kind of a check and an enrichment of the program you've got. Or
so it sounds like a form of assessment there. Sorry, I was just saying it's almost a form of assessment there. I guess that would be a sort of formative assessment of how your class is doing with that unit.
Absolutely. And then if you want to, still it could be formative or indeed more summative towards the end, you could have an inquiry at the end of the program of study or the series of lessons you've done on a topic. You say, okay, what do we think? What are the key questions? A bit like the book that you read together. You say, well, what was that book about? You've kind of done the material, you've discussed it, you've done various activities about the book. They've got lots to discuss. So I think, some people would say, critical thinking, you can't do it abstractly, it's got to involve content. Of course, yes, you can't have a thoughtful discussion about nothing. But I think it's got a legitimate place in being something where you're going to explore an idea or a concept or a value or an ethos, just to see where they are at the beginning, halfway through as a kind of a formative assessment, or at the end to check, have they really got and understood this? So all three places have got their role, but it depends on the objective.
I see. So if you're inquiring into what your class already know, what they already understand, then I absolutely get how it would be useful there. And that reminds me of one thing that has really surprised me, actually. And I think this is perhaps where asking children what they think can be incredibly valuable as a form of assessment. Is when we teach, of course, we're imparting knowledge about things we think children don't know. But there's that other area where there's misconceptions, where children think they know, but actually, for whatever reason, what they maybe happen to believe is simply not correct. It is incorrect. So, and I have found that when I am doing a sort of a discussion, children will quite freely offer up something. What I'm saying is, if there is a misconception swimming around in their head, they will quite freely volunteer that up in a way I probably would never have caught if they were merely responding to teacher questions. Because, of course, I'm not assuming they have this misconception. So, for example, we were doing, one time we were doing a unit on space, and I think we were doing a sort of would you rather question, and it was something like, which planet, if you couldn't live on Earth, which planet would you like to live on? And it was, it was a bit of a fun one, of course. And the children got to say, what they thought about the planets. But it was also a very, very good way for me to see, generally speaking, what had they already learned. And I had a boy talk about Mercury, and he said, "Oh, it's closest to the sun." And then he started talking about how cold it was and everything, and how the temperature was so and so, and it was covered in ice and everything. And we had to unpick that. And he really stuck to his guns for a while. He wouldn't be persuaded initially that he sort of got it wrong. And eventually another child was able to do it. And it's like you say, it's that sort of thinking vocabulary, I can't remember exactly how they put it, but they were essentially saying, well, what you said about it being closest to the sun, it wouldn't then make sense for it to be the coldest planet, would it? And it sort of ran with that. But my point is, had we not had that exercise, that boy could very well have gone away believing that incorrect fact, for a very, very long time. So I think that targeting of misconceptions, that identifying of them, is such a valuable outcome of doing this sort of discussion.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. When I was a head of RE in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, I would probably do 1 in 6 lessons as with a GCSE group. 1 in 6 lessons would be philosophy for children or philosophy for communities type lesson. And it was, at the time when I started out doing that, I thought, God, this is a bit of a risk because I'm not actually covering the content for the exam. As in sort of, jug and mug teaching. Here's the information, I'm going to pour it into their heads as entertainingly and interestingly as I can, but that's the fundamental deal. But what I found was it was absolutely that process of getting them to discuss and agree, disagree, etc. with each other. That I started. My God, they've completely misunderstood that. I obviously didn't teach that very well.
It can be quite humbling sometimes, can't it, as a teacher?
Absolutely.
Where did you get that from?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great reminder that sort of what I think I'm teaching is not necessarily what they're taking. So it was a great diagnostic tool, and I kept it going at A level. I had 80 students doing the full RS A level, and that I'm absolutely sure that a large part of why the students had chosen to do that was that they thoroughly enjoyed the discussing of the ideas and challenging each other. And it was great for me as a teacher because I could spot misconceptions that would, if that turned up in an exam, it would immediately mark them down. So it was a risk, but it really paid off. Their grades were excellent. So
I suppose while we're talking about the benefits of these discussions, I suppose one as well, and this ties it into something that I think we've all heard a lot about quite recently in education, which is the role of memory. Learning being a change in long-term memory. That view. So and obviously, if you're reviewing, like you said before, if you're doing a discussion, in the middle of your topic, at the end of your unit, and you are asking children to back up their opinions, their judgments with evidence, with facts, with things they've learned, you are asking them to delve into their memory banks and retrieve things and actually use that information. So I think you can make an argument that these discussions can have their role in, I suppose, in strengthening the knowledge of the facts that have been taught.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, this idea that learning is a change in long-term memory. I think it came from the Ofsted overview of research in January 2019. They said if nothing in the long-term memory had been altered, nothing's been learned. But in that same paragraph, they said, although there are, of course, other aspects to learning. So it's an important addition. Of course, if you can't remember something you've been taught, you can't really say you've learned it. But so remember, yes, there are other aspects. It's how things are remembered as well. What's interesting is, there's quite a bit of memory research to back this up. In that, if you make pupils struggle with information, they tend to remember it more because it's that what's had to fire to fire together, wires together. It's kind of they've had to put some effort and struggle into remembering those ideas. Those last and connect to prior learning much more effectively. If it's just a matter of handing the information over and saying, right, repeat that in your head until you're thoroughly bored of it, and then regurgitate it in the exam, then I would say they might know something in very short term, but they don't understand it. So, there's an example that comes clearly to mind here. If I was going to teach the concept of a tourist, let's say there's a test next week and they're doing geography, and there's one of the questions in the test next week is, what is a tourist? And it's worth 2 marks. One approach I could take is to write down the exam accepted answer. A tourist is baddy, write it on the board. They dutifully copy it down. They go away. Hopefully they kind of remember it and learn it in their own way, which is usually repetition, which is very boring and inefficient way of remembering stuff. But they do that if they haven't been taught better methods. They come back to the test, they regurgitate this answer, and indeed they get the 2 marks, but they haven't thought about the definition at all. So what I prefer to do is, in terms of dialogue and thinking and reasoning and that sort of stuff, is play a game where you get them into what James Nottingham might call it the pit of learning, which is not tell them what a tourist is. I said, well, what is a tourist? And one of them might say, oh, it's when you go to see another place. And I said, so blind people can't be tourists. So we're into the game of, they give me a definition and I give them a counter example to their definition. So it's to upset their definition, force them to think more deeply and refine it. And it's very much a game. So another one might say, oh, it's when you go and have a nice time in another country. And I said, oh, so I can't go on holiday in my own country. They go, oh no, okay. So it's now, once you've done 5 minutes or 10 minutes of playing that game of definition, counter example, bouncing back and forth, and then you say, hey, let's go and see what the examiner thinks. They'll look at that. Now that they've struggled with the concept, they can look at the definition and evaluate it. They could go, oh, they've absolutely nailed it. That's beautiful. Or they might look at the definition that the examiner gives and goes, that's rubbish. We can make 5 exceptions to that. So now I've got people who have got living, nourished conceptual thought where they understand what a tourist is.
Either way, they're engaged. I mean, so either way, they now become engaged with that question in a way they were previously.
Yeah, and if and there will be teachers out there who say, "Oh, but that's what they've got to write in the exam. What's the point of doing that?" So, amazingly, pupils and students are fantastic at understanding. There's a game to be played. We're going to learn the definition. We'll regurgitate it in the exam, but actually, I know there's a lot more to the story, and when it comes to A level, I'm actually going to smash it. You can't have these regurgitated surface level knowledge answers at A level. It's just not going to work. But you can't bring that skill in at sixth form. It starts at primary school, and kids enjoy it, as you say. It's fun,
Yeah. And as a teacher, I mean, I hope I'm not totally alone in this. I quite enjoy it too. It keeps things fresh. I think it's a nice way to spend time. It's genuinely engaging and interesting for the teacher as well as for the children.
Absolutely, it keeps you more grape than raisin. Every lesson is fresh and different. You don't kind of get into that habitual way where every staff room, well, maybe not every staff room, but a lot of staff rooms have got that kind of teacher who's 5 years from retirement. In essence, they've retired but haven't told the head teacher. They're still doing excellent and well practiced lessons, but they're bored. They've lost the juice and the life and the motivation of the lessons. And yet you get other teachers who are 5 years of retirement and they're still learning, they're still taking risks, they're still enjoying the whole process. And I think this kind of lesson, not only this, but this kind of lesson can really help keep things alive.
Absolutely. Okay, so Will, I'm going to ask you. I think I'd like to move on to a sort of area related to this, but more let's say you've been doing, your discussions on a regular basis with your children for a while. You've got the ground rules agreed to. The habit is there. Good things are happening. But now I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about the answer. But I'm going to ask you, what are the problems that tend to crop up a bit later, and how would you go about solving some of those?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
To Schools Week, Oak National Academy have announced the appointment of a new interim CEO. This comes as the online school sets a leaving date for its current boss, Matt Hood, now due to step down at the end of March. Director of Product and Engineering John Roberts is named as the temporary leader. Roberts was part of the team that launched the organisation 5 years ago. In the article, Roberts is quoted as saying, "Oak has an important role to play going forward, supporting curriculum standards, tackling workload, and innovating using AI." Matt Hood had acted as interim chief executive since Oak became an arm's-length public body in 2022. The recruitment process for Hood lasted a year, and the Department for Education confirmed his appointment to a permanent position in May 2024. Oak have stressed that Hood's permanent replacement will be selected following the principles of the public appointments process. Schools Week reported in November that a judicial review of the decision to turn the Oak National Academy into a government quango had been put on hold due to concerns expressed by other groups that Oak would pose an existential risk to their sector. Oak published its last impact report in October, which said more than 1 in 3 teachers had used Oak resources between February and July last year. Almost 75% said its resources had saved them time over the same period. BBC Tees focuses on the issue of young carers being, in the words of a local head teacher, unfairly marked as late to school as a result of having to drop off siblings. 4 areas in the northeast of England, including Newcastle and Sunderland, have the highest rate of school absences in the country, according to the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. The head of a school in the region spoke to the BBC and said it was unfair to mark child carers as absent because they had responsibilities, such as helping a disabled parent to get out of bed. He went on to say that changes to attendance guidance had created an unfair system, meaning lateness after registers closed resulted in a U mark for an unauthorised absence for a morning session, even if the pupil was only half an hour late. The head teacher went on to say that the reality was that these pupils were at school most of the day. Analysis of the Department for Education figures by the Powerhouse found that the top 9 areas for unauthorised absence were in the north. Northern Powerhouse Partnership CEO said the figures were indicative of high levels of deprivation and an educational north-south divide. A spokesperson for the Department for Education said it had inherited an absence crisis, but was laser-focused on tackling the problem. The Guardian covers a story about a secondary school head teacher who has obtained a court order to be paid damages in the settlement of a legal claim against abusive parents who he alleged launched a campaign of harassment against him. The head teacher was successful in his claim against the parents of 2 former pupils who he said had been harassing him since May 2023. The parents' alleged behaviour included starting an online petition to remove the head teacher from his role and establishing Facebook groups and Instagram accounts which encouraged online abuse against him. The couple were also accused of confronting the head teacher and the school's co-chair of governors outside their homes, although the couple denied this. The legal settlement was reached in January and the couple agreed to pay £10,000 in costs and damages, and agreed to multiple restraining and non-harassment orders. Full details of the story can be found online.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Okay, so welcome back to the Saturday Social with me, Will Mercer, and we are talking thinking in the classroom with Will Ord. So, Will, a minute ago, I asked you where to think about the sorts of problems which might crop up in the classroom when you've already established these thinking routines.
Yeah, great question, Will. I guess the problems are many and varied. It depends, for example, if you're talking about sort of 4 and 5-year-olds and the sort of things they're going to come across as opposed to 16 or 17-year-olds. So there's a lot of variety within that one question. I think I'd give 3 broad answers, but they can all be practically applied. I think my first approach, very much taken from the philosophy for children kind of pedagogy, is, if where possible, is to get the community to identify and solve the problem themselves. And when I say community, I mean the class is in the P4C tradition. It's called the community of inquiry. It's to say, hey, is there a problem here, and how might we solve it? For example, let's say some people are dominating in terms of their verbal contributions, and that habit is not quite settled into being more inclusive and open. So we might say, okay, do we think that everyone has a fair say? And we might have a blind or mole vote on that, where people shut their eyes, I count the hands, say, yes, there seems to be a problem. What can we do about it? And I remember one class, this is the primary second, they come and said, well, someone needs to look out for fairness. They have a special role in our community. And they all seem to know who this person should be. So it was a very sort of sensible and respected pupil. But they all respected his voice, and that role became known as the boots of justice. And we say, okay, today who's wearing the boots of justice?
That's fantastic.
And they had to do it respectfully, and they could do it without names, this sort of thing. But they said, I've noticed that, and it would be great if we could change it. And then we'd come up with practical ideas. So step one, or first suggestion into a very rich question, is, can I get the class to spotlight, recognize the problem, and then come up with their own solution? And in that sense, you're giving them ownership of their own community, and they're not becoming dependent on the teacher to solve the problems. You're helping them to become independent, collaborative learners. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, you can have 1,000 different kinds of problem or challenge, however you want to label them. I think one of the key things for a teacher who wants to generate and develop great thinking and communication in the classroom is to have a really rich repertoire of questions. There's 45 questions that I think that all teachers could do with in their repertoire. For example, let's say my class, they're very good at sharing opinions, but they're not very good at backing them up. So there's 5 or 6 questions that could be used just to get them to think about the reasons for and give examples for their opinions. And there's different ways of phrasing that, because if you keep saying, oh, can you give me an example? Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example? That gets boring and repetitive. So range of questions, and you can freely download the resource from my website just to have a repertoire. The easy way to use that resource, print it off. It's a one side of A4, and you just add 1 question per week to your repertoire. So let's say everyone's got their favorite questions for the classroom to get good thinking going. On the sheet, you'll find one of the questions is, what would someone who disagreed with you say? And that's, you think, oh God, I've never come across that question, or I haven't used that question before. I would love to use that to get them to think about empathizing with other viewpoints, not just sticking to their own. So a problem might be they just see things from their perspective and they're very fixed in that. What would someone who disagreed with you say is a great way of getting them to argue with their own idea, not getting another pupil to do it for them. So range of questions, absolutely brilliant for dealing with all sorts of problems. The tumbleweed problem, classic one, you seem to have hit a bit of a desert. There's, no one's got anything to say. If you've got the question, where do you think we've got stuck here? That can open the discussion back up. If you haven't got that question, you're kind of thinking, oh God, how do I move on? It seems to have died. So second suggestion, range of questions. I think third one is, again, it's getting back to this critical art that I don't think primary in particular, but secondary schools are doing nearly enough about, which is developing the art of argument. And writing templates for that, thinking templates, can be really, really helpful.
Can I ask you about one thing that I've often found happens is, it's going well and everything, and then I get some children who are quieter than others, and then I think, oh, it's just because other children sort of dominating the discussion. So we sort of sort that out, and then you get a few, and they don't really seem. And I've had one or two classes where I've had one or two children who essentially never contribute, no matter what. It feels like no matter what I do. And when I've spoken to parents about this, they sort of smile and they say, yeah, but you have to understand, he or she, they're very shy. They're a shy child. They're just shy. And I kind of feel like tearing my hair out. It feels like a sort of a bit of a cop-out. It's an excuse, I think. And I think you can't, when you're 7 years old or 8 years old, you're too young to decide that you don't want to talk. You don't want your voice. I think it's not about being an extrovert. It's not about being the most confident person in the room. It's about saying what you are thinking. And I don't think I think if we give children a message that you have to be special or you have to be extra confident to say what you are thinking, well, then we're saying it's something that it's kind of okay for some people not to do, because there are some people who are shyer than others. And how have you approached that problem when you face that?
Oh God, that's a really lovely question, Will. I get asked this question a lot over the last 30 odd years of developing P4C. I suppose that there's a number of things to kind of question. Is first question is, why is the child quiet? And that's not a kind of a judgmental question. It's just, well, can I find out, are they fully engaged and thinking with a very rich voice in their own head? Or are they away with the fairies and, Elvis has left the building? And so I don't take silence or non-verbal participation as a sign of they're not engaged. In philosophy for children, the approach is it's voluntary contribution only. Only if someone feels like they've got something to say and they want to say it, then that's the rule. It's not that I know there are other schools that say, okay, well, you've got to keep everyone on their toes, and we have lolly sticks with all their names on. We're going to pull one out at random and say, what are you thinking? But I can see why that's done, but it's not my approach. I think that can put stress and pressure on a child, particularly if they don't actually have anything to say. I mean, how would we like it if someone, you go to some teacher training, suddenly the trainer turns around and you say, what do you think? What? God, give me a chance.
Yeah.
I think a voluntary principle is important, but yes, we need to check, are they engaged or not? And in which case you can just say, okay, could you just break down into small groups and have a discussion? And you can very quickly tell, you just drift over to that group and you can find out, are they talking about the topic or are they clueless? In which case, you either re-engage them or you let them carry on. So that's one thing. I think the other thing with quiet children who don't contribute much is it the child's issue or is it the emotional and social dynamic in the classroom? Because a lot of the time, and I think typically this can happen with a lot of girls who've got a lot of great things to say in the classroom, but there seems to be lots of boys who just shoot off the hip, aren't giving quality contributions, and they fear that they'll be laughed at or they'll be ignored, or it's not worth saying this because no one's going to, these boys aren't going to respect it. These are boys, as the phrase goes, prone to premature articulation. So it's an old chestnut. But the issue then is not actually the quiet child, it's that there isn't a caring dynamic in the room that gives that child the confidence that when I say something, it will be listened to and respected. So I think our instinct is to go to the quiet child and immediately assume the issue's with them. It might be a dynamic.
Okay, now I'm just sorry. I'm just looking at the time, and I see we have precious little of it left. I think we might have time for to talk about one more area, and it's something that you've just raised. It's that of group discussions, smaller group discussions, rather than one whole class discussion. So I'm going to ask you another question and give you a moment to think about it. How can you effectively ensure that you are having small group discussions and that it is a good use of the class's time?
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
All right, this is the Saturday Social with me, Will Mercer. I'm joined by Will Ord. And Will, I asked you just a moment ago about group work, group discussion. And I wanted to cover this just before we finish, because I think, of course, group work has its place, as you've just said, within a wider class discussion. But I think group discussion is so easy to start. It can be a part of any lesson, even if that lesson is not a sort of class-wide discussion as such. So how do you ensure that group talk is effective?
Again, great question, Will. I think the first thing is maybe this, and I would say this goes for all group work, whether it's discussion or working on an art project or building a spaceship or whatever they're doing, is to be really clear about and specific and detailed about what the discussion is and what the kind of success criteria are. What are you expecting when they've finished the discussion? So they've got very clear idea of what we're discussing and what we need to get to at the end. If you just turn to the class and say, discuss that in small groups, I think that could be very unclear, and it's open to abuse of, if there may be some who just, want to sort of pull out or disengage. I think if you're really specific, it gives them the reassurance that, okay, I'm dead clear about what we're meant to be discussing, and we've got to get to this end point. So it's clarity of instruction is really key. I think another aspect to this is how you've grouped the children, and who's talking to who. Is it friendship groups? Is it have you got mixed ability groups? Have you kind of quietly leveled and streamed them without them so-called knowing? So yes, think about, and I'm not preferring one over the other necessarily. I'm just thinking that has a definite effect over what kind of discussions and engagement you get. So how's it? The final thing is maybe if you've got groups of maybe 4 or more, I would give someone a role in it and start building them as facilitators so that they're looking out for inclusion. Are we sticking to the task? Is this fair? Has everyone had a chance to speak? You're going to get one of them to develop those skills of running a good conversation with others. They can still contribute to the actual task itself, but make mini facilitators who are just going to play that role in the small group. So there's a few strategies I would use. There are many others, but you're right. It's a challenge. If you look at the research, peer education on sort of John Hattie's visible learning, etc., that can have a very positive effect. But the challenge is, well, what if they're just sharing ignorance? Or so you've got to. I think that's where the clarity of instruction and being really specific, so everyone's dead clear about what's going on. That's why it's so important.
So can I ask you then, and this was probably going to be my last question, but I love this idea of there being jobs that you give children, or sometimes even the children might suggest themselves to enhance a discussion. You talked about the boots of justice, and that's a phrase that's going to live with me for a long time. I love it. Are there any other particular roles that are a sort of go-to that you might give to a child or to children to make the discussion better?
Yes, definitely. Again, up to you to judge when it's appropriate, when it's useful. The footwear thing, the boots of justice, got a life of its own, fortunately, stroke unfortunately. So there were the scribes' sandals.
Right.
And that was a child who was going to note the key ideas down on the board or on a flip chart or in some way, so that I'm not picking out the core ideas as the arbiter of what's right and wrong. One of them are. And that was particularly good if you could quietly sort of offer that role to perhaps someone who verbalizes things a lot. It keeps them a little bit more occupied and just generally gives more space for others to contribute. So there's a little twist or adaptation. So, and it's having a list of what we're discussing, just, if they're just key words or key questions. A lot of kids find that very useful to keep the thread of the discussion, to keep the thread of the dialogue. A lot of them refer back to it and make connections. So that's one. One other with the sandals of surprise. These are spring-loaded sandals, and this I know,
of course they are. Yeah.
Yes. This is someone who's looking for connections between ideas that someone hasn't made yet. So they're going to say, hey, this idea mentioned by Sam over there connects with Rajiv's idea over there. And they kind of spring from one pupil to the other saying, this idea connects to that. And no one's noticed. So that's if you want to upgrade the synthetic thinking, which of course is very, very core to creative thinking. How to connect two unconnected things and show, wow, we've made a connection here. And to be honest, I would encourage teachers just to make, it doesn't have to be shoewear, but just create roles wherever you've got an issue or something you want to upgrade. Give a child a special role in being able to upgrade that and help everyone develop it. And they love doing it. You could get them just to give a little feedback at the end of the lesson saying, did you notice who did it really well? And who would you award those shoes to next time? Or, can we recognize and celebrate good practice? So
I love that idea of them choosing the next one as well. One that always worked well for me is if I found there was a child who was basically just not listening and becoming quite disengaged, I'd often give them a little post-it note and I'd say, okay, I want to know who's speaking in this discussion. So every time someone puts their hand out and talks, could you write their initials down? And then we can see who's not speaking, and then we can see who is maybe perhaps speaking too much if that's an issue in the class. And I found I had some children, I had one child in particular who was very bright. She was exactly the kind of child who I thought would love these sorts of discussions, but she sometimes, she would have her say and then sit back and sort of roll her eyes for the next 20 minutes. Whereas when I gave her this role, suddenly she loved it. And she was the one saying, oh, when do we next do a P4C discussion, or when can we next get in a circle and talk about something? So it was so interesting to see just how her perspective was transformed as well. Right. Now, I mean, honestly, Will, I would love to carry on talking about this. I think we could go all day, but I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close there. We are simply out of time. But I've really, really enjoyed that. That's given me so much to think about. Sorry, I promise you that is not an incredibly lame pun I'm finishing on. And thank you so much for your time and all your suggestions. I know, I hope I speak for many people and I say it was really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
Will, it's been a total pleasure. You're brilliant. Wonderful, wonderful questions. So you've given me wonderful waves to surf on, and hats off. So thoroughly enjoyed, and thank you.
Brilliant. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.